Hey everyone, and welcome back. We are about to finish James and the Giant Peach by Roald Dahl. So, let's do our quick review because we are at the last few chapters. So, here we go. James Henry Trotter is our main character. Seen right there. He lived with his mean Aunt Sponge and Aunt Spiker. They were horrible people. So, James got some magic and he accidentally tripped, didn't he? So, it fell into a peach tree. It created the biggest peach anyone has ever seen. It was as big as a small house. James went inside and met some new friends. The glowworm, the grasshopper, Miss Ladybug, the centipede, the earthworm, Miss Spider, and the silkworm. They have gone on a crazy adventure, rolling down the English countryside, into the ocean, dealing with sharks, flying over the top of the ocean using seagulls, meeting the cloud men, and then falling onto the top of the Empire State Building. So the people of New York City were a little bit scared, weren't they? They thought it was a bomb. But we are just about to learn what they really think once the peach has hit the top of the Empire State Building. So we are going to read chapters 37 through 39 today. Here we go. Chapter 37. It was really an amazing sight, and in 2 or 3 minutes, as soon as the people below realized that this now couldn't possibly be a bomb, they came pouring out of the shelters and the subways to gape at this marvel. The streets for half a mile around the building were jammed with men and women, and when the word spread that there was actually living things moving on top of the great round ball, then everyone went wild with excitement. "It's a flying saucer," they shouted. "They're from outer space. They must be men from Mars, or maybe they came from the moon." And a man who had a pair of binoculars to his eyes said, "They look pretty particular to me, I'll tell you that." Police cars and fire engines came screaming in all over the city and pulled up outside the Empire State Building. 200 firemen and 600 policemen swarmed into the building and went up in the elevators as high as they could go. Then they poured out onto the observation roof, which is a place where tourists usually stand, just at the bottom of the big spike. All the policemen were holding their guns at the ready, with their fingers on the triggers, and the firemen were clutching their hatchets. But from where they stood, almost directly underneath the peach, they really couldn't see the travelers on top. "Ahoy there!" shouted the chief of police. "Come out and show yourselves!" Suddenly, the great brown head of the centipede appeared over the side of the peach. His black eyes, as large and round as 2 marbles, glared down at the policemen and the firemen below. Then his monstrous, ugly face broke into a wide grin. The policemen and firemen all started shouting at once. "Look out," they cried. "It's a dragon! It's not a dragon, it's a wampus! It's a gorgon! It's a sea serpent! A proc! A manticore!" 3 firemen and 5 policemen fainted and had to be carried away. "It's a snozwonger," cried the chief of police. "It's a wang noodle," cried the head of the fire department. The centipede kept on grinning. He seemed to be enjoying enormously the commotion that he was causing. "Now see here," shouted the chief of police, cupping his hands to his mouth. "You listen to me. I want you to tell me exactly where you come from." "We've come from thousands of miles away," the centipede shouted back, grinning more broadly than ever and showing his brown teeth. "There you are," cried the chief of police. "I told you they came from Mars." I guess you're right, said the head of the fire department. At this point, the old green grasshopper poked his huge green head over the side of the peach along with the centipedes. 6 more big, strong men fainted when they saw him. That one's an onyx, screamed the head of fire department. I just know. Or a cockatrice, yelled the chief of police. Stand back, men. It may jump down on us at any moment. What on earth are you all talking about? The old green grasshopper said to the centipede. Search me, the centipede answered, but they seem to be in an awful stew about something. Then Miss Spider's large, black, murderous-looking head, which to a stranger was probably the most terrifying of all, appeared next to the grasshoppers. Snakes and ladders, yelled the head of the fire department. We're all finished now. It's a giant scorpula. It's worse than that, cried the chief of police. It's a vicious kind. Oh, just look at its vermicuous, gruesome face. What kind? Is that the kind that eats fully grown men for breakfast? Asked the head of the fire department, going white as a sheet. I'm afraid it is, the chief of police answered. Oh, please, why doesn't someone help us get down from here? Miss Spider called out. It's making me giddy. This could be a trick, the head of the fire department said. Don't make a move until I say. They've probably got space guns, said the chief of police. But we've got to do something, the head of the fire department announced grimly. About 5 million people are standing down there on the streets watching us. Then why don't you put up a ladder, said the chief of police. I'll stand at the bottom and hold it steady for you while you go up and see what's happening. Thanks very much, snapped the head of the fire department. Soon, there were no less than 7 large, fantastic faces peering down over the side of the peach. The centipedes, the old green grasshoppers, Miss Spiders, the earthworm, the ladybug, the silkworms, and the glowworms. And a sort of panic was beginning to break out among the firemen and policemen on the rooftop. Then, all at once, the panic stopped, and a great gasp of astonishment came across all of the group below. For now, a small boy was seen to be standing up there beside the other creatures. His hair was blowing in the wind, and he was laughing and waving and calling out, Hello, everyone! Hello! For a few moments, the men below just stood and stared and gasped. They simply couldn't believe their eyes. Bless my soul, cried the head of the fire department, going red in the face. It's really a little boy, isn't it? Don't be frightened of us, please, James called out. We are so glad to be here. What about those others beside you? Shouted the chief of police. Aren't they dangerous? Of course they're not dangerous, James said. They're the nicest creatures in the world. Allow me to introduce them to you one by one, and then I'm sure you will believe me. So he began. My friends, this is the centipede, and let me make it known, he is so sweet and gentle that, although he's overgrown, the Queen of Spain again and again has summoned him by phone to babysit and sing and knit and be a chaperone when nurse is off and all the royal children are alone. Small wonder, said the fireman, they're no longer on the throne. The earthworm, on the other hand, said James, beginning to expand, is great for digging up the land and making old soils newer. Moreover, you should understand he would be absolutely grand for digging subway tunnels and making you a sewer. The earthworm blushed and beamed with pride. Miss Spider clapped and cheered and cried, Could any words be truer? And the grasshopper, ladies and gents, is a boon in millions of ways. You have only to ask him to give you a tune, and he plays and he plays and he plays. As a toy for your children, he's perfectly sweet. There's nothing so good in the shops. You've only to tickle the soles of his feet, and he hops and he hops and he hops." "He can't be very fierce," exclaimed the head of the cops. And now, without excuse, I'd like to introduce this charming glowworm, lover of simplicity. She is so easy to install on your ceiling or your wall, and although this smacks a bit of eccentricity, it's really rather clever, for thereafter you will never, never have the slightest need for electricity. At which no less than 52 policemen cried, "If that's true, that creature will get some fabulous publicity." And here we have Miss Spider, with a mile of thread inside her, who has personally requested me to say that she has never met Miss Muffet on her charming little tuffet, and if she had, she'd not have frightened her away. Should her looks sometimes alarm you, then I don't think it would harm you to repeat at least 100 times a day, "I must never kill a spider, I must only help and guide her, and invite her in the nursery to play." The police all nodded slightly, and the firemen smiled politely, and about a dozen people cried, "Hooray!" And here's my darling ladybug, so beautiful, so kind, my greatest comfort since this trip began. She has 400 children, and she's left them all behind, but there's coming on the next peach if they can. The cops cried, "She's entrancing!" All the firemen started dancing, and the crowds all started cheering to a man. "And now the silkworm," James went on, "whose silk will bear comparison with all the greatest silks there are in Rome and Philadelphia. And if you would search the whole world through, from Paraguay to Timbuktu, I don't think you would find one bit of silk that would compare with it. Even the shops in Singapore don't have the stuff, and what is more, this silkworm had, I'll have you know, the honor, not so long ago, to spin and weave and sew and press the Queen of England's wedding dress. And she already made and sent a waistcoat for your president." "Well, good for her!" the cops cried out, and all at once a mighty shout went up around the Empire State. "Let's get them down at once. Why wait?" And here is a picture of the whole crew. Ta-da! Oh, there's the little glowworm. Chapter 38. 5 minutes later, they were all safely down, and James was excitedly telling his story to a group of flabbergasted officials. And suddenly, everyone who had come over on the peach was a hero. They were all escorted to the steps of City Hall, where the mayor of New York made a speech of welcome. And while he was doing this, 100 steeplejacks, armed with ropes and ladders and pulleys, swarmed up to the top of the Empire State Building and lifted the giant peach off of the spike and lowered it to the ground. Then the mayor shouted, "We must have a ticker-tape parade for these wonderful visitors." And so a procession was formed, and in the leading car, which was an enormous open limousine, sat James and all his friends. Next came the giant peach itself. Men with cranes and hooks had quickly hoisted it onto a very large truck, and there it now sat, looking just as huge and proud and brave as ever. There was, of course, a bit of a hole in the bottom where the spike of the Empire State Building had gone in, but who cared about that, or indeed about the peach juice that was dripping onto the street? Behind the peach, skidding about all over the place in the peach juice, came the mayor's limousine. And behind the mayor's limousine came about 20 other limousines carrying all the important people of the city. And the crowds went wild with excitement. They leaned out the windows of the skyscrapers, cheering and yelling and screaming and clapping and throwing out bits of white paper and ticker tape. and James and his friends stood up in their car and waved at them as they passed by. Then a rather curious thing happened. The procession was moving slowly along Fifth Avenue when suddenly a little girl in a red dress ran out from the crowd and shouted, "Oh, James, James, could I please have a tiny taste of your marvelous peach?" "Help yourself," James shouted back. "Eat all you want. It won't keep forever anyway." No sooner had he said this than about 50 other children exploded out of the crowd and came running onto the street. "Can we have some too?" they cried. "Of course you can," James answered. "Everyone can have some." The children jumped up onto the truck and swarmed it like ants all over the giant peach, eating and eating to their heart's content. And as the news of what happened spread quickly from street to street, more and more boys and girls came running from all directions to join the feast. Soon there was a trail of children a mile long chasing after the peach as it proceeded slowly up Fifth Avenue. Really, it was a fantastic sight. To some people, it looked as though the Pied Piper had suddenly descended upon New York, and to James, who had never dreamed that there could be so many children as this in the world, it was the most marvelous thing that had ever happened. By the time the procession was over, the whole gigantic fruit had been completely eaten up, and only the big brown stone in the middle, licked clean and shiny by 10,000 eager little tongues, was left standing on the truck. Chapter 39. And thus the journey ended. But the travelers lived on. Every one of them became rich and successful in the new country. The centipede was made vice president in charge of sales of a high-class firm of boot shoe manufacturers. The earthworm, with his lovely pink skin, was employed by a company that made women's face creams to speak commercials on television. The silkworm and Miss Spider, after they had both been taught to make nylon thread instead of silk, set up a factory together and made ropes for tightrope walkers. The glowworm became the light inside the torch of the Statue of Liberty, and thus saved a grateful city from having to pay a huge electricity bill every year. The old green grasshopper became a member of the New York Symphony Orchestra, where his playing was greatly admired. The ladybug, who had been haunted all her life by the fear that her house was on fire and her children were all gone, married the head of the fire department and lived happily ever after. And as for the enormous peach stone, it was set up permanently in a place of honor in Central Park and became a famous monument. But it was not only a famous monument, it was also a famous house. And inside the famous house, there lived a famous person, James Henry Trotter himself. And there's the little peach stone, or the peach pit. I know some people call it that. And all you had to do any day of the week was to go and knock upon the door, and the door would always be open to you, and you would always be asked to come inside and see the famous room where James had met his friends. And sometimes, if you were very lucky, you would find the old green grasshopper in there as well, resting peacefully in a chair before the fire. Or perhaps it would be the ladybug who dropped in for a cup of tea and gossip, or the centipede to show off a new batch of particularly elegant boots that he had just acquired. Every day of the week, hundreds and hundreds of children from far and near came pouring into the city to see this marvelous peach stone in the park, and James Henry Trotter, who once, if you remember, had been the saddest and loneliest little boy that you could find, now had all the friends and playmates in the world. And because so many of them were always begging him to tell and tell again the story of his adventures on the peach, he thought it would be nice if one day he sat down and wrote a book. So he did. And this is what you have just finished reading. The end. So that was James and the Giant Peach by Roald Dahl. Excuse me. Let's get to our discussion questions for the last 3 chapters of the book. First, I hope you all have enjoyed it. This is one of my favorites to read. So fun. All right. So after the people of New York realize that the peach isn't a bomb, what do they think it is? Why do you think they think that? So they think that it's an alien spaceship, don't they? They're like, it's from Mars, it's from the moon. Because they've never seen anything like that ever, right? It's very weird. How were James and the bugs treated in New York? So I'd say at first everyone was a little scared, right? So the police and the firemen all went up to the top of the Empire State Building and they had no idea what to expect. And then they saw a giant centipede. So they were a little frightened at first, weren't they? But once they found out that they're all very nice and James was up there and he's been fine and explained all of his friends and the adventures they had, they were celebrated. They met the mayor and he welcomed them to the city. And then they had a parade down the streets. So what happened to the peach during the parade? A little girl came up and said, "Can I have a bite of your peach?" And James, of course, said, "Yes, come on down." Then every child in New York seemed to come out and get a bite of the peach. I am so sorry. Every child in New York seemed to come out and get a bite of the peach. So the whole thing was eaten by the end of the parade, wasn't it? What happened to the bugs in the end, and James? So let's double check. They all lived happily ever after, didn't they? Let us see. So the centipede became vice president in charge of a boot and shoe manufacturer. The earthworm sold ladies' face creams. The silkworm and Miss Spider made ropes for tight walkers. The glowworm became the light inside the Statue of Liberty. And the old green grasshopper became a member of the New York Symphony Orchestra. And the ladybug married the head of the fire department and lived happily ever after. What about James, though? He lived in the Peach Pit in Central Park and always had friends over, didn't he? And then he wrote a book. So, speaking of, he wrote a book. Who was telling this story the whole time? It was James, wasn't it? So at the very beginning, I asked you to guess who was narrating the story. I want to know, maybe who guessed James and is really good at this? So we have one vocab word for these chapters. Eccentricity, because it rhymes with electricity. Eccentric is something that's kind of odd or different behavior. And so eccentricity is an oddity or some kind of weird behavior is what it is. So we have now officially finished James and the Giant Peach. I thank you so much for joining us for these chapter read-throughs and discussions. tomorrow, Wednesday, June 10th, we are going to have a Zoom meeting where we're going to review the book real quick and then watch the movie together. So the movie is about an hour and 10 minutes. So what we will do is, like I said, start with some discussion about maybe your favorite part of the book. So think about your favorite parts of the book, and then we'll watch the movie and have a quick discussion, if people are still sticking around, about what's different between the book and the movie, because there's always some differences, isn't there? So I hope that you join us tomorrow afternoon for that. So I can't wait to see you all, and thank you again for joining us as we just finished James and the Giant Peach by Roald Dahl. Bye, everyone!